Let me ask you something. When you think about 1958, what comes to mind? Maybe you remember chrome that gleamed like polished silver. Perhaps you recall those space-age tail fins reaching skyward. But here's what you might not remember: a car that looked like a Pontiac, drove like a Chevrolet, and carried a name that spoke of Paris streets instead of American highways. The 1958 Pontiac Parisienne, a car that never officially crossed the border into American dealerships, a car built in Oshawa, Ontario, that would become one of Pontiac's longest-running nameplates, and a car that tells us everything about how the automobile industry navigated the complex dance between two neighboring nations during the golden age of chrome. Picture this. It's 1958, the year General Motors celebrated its 50th anniversary, the year that brought us the Chevrolet Impala, the year Detroit draped every surface in chrome and pushed styling to theatrical extremes. And it was also a year when the economy decided to throw everyone a curveball. The 1958 recession, officially running from August 1957 through April 1958, hit the auto industry hard. Car sales plummeted from nearly 8 million purchases in 1955 to just 4.3 million in 1958. American consumers, watching unemployment climb and their confidence waver, decided to hold on to their cars a bit longer. Auto sales dropped 31% compared to 1957, making 1958 the worst auto year since World War II. But up in Canada, General Motors was playing a different game entirely. A game shaped by tariffs, trade policy, and the practical realities of building cars for a smaller but distinct market. The Parisienne emerged from this unique set of circumstances not as an afterthought, but as a carefully engineered solution to a Canadian problem. And today we're going to tell you exactly why this car mattered, why it was built the way it was, and why you probably never saw one unless you ventured north of the border. The origins. Why Canada needed its own Pontiacs. To understand the Parisienne, you need to understand something fundamental about the Canadian auto industry in the 1950s. Canada wasn't just a smaller market, it was a protected market, shielded by tariffs designed to encourage domestic manufacturing. GM's Canadian operation grew rapidly in the early 1920s after the company decided to leverage tariff agreements within the British Commonwealth by making Oshawa its export manufacturing base. By the mid-1950s, this arrangement had created an interesting situation. GM of Canada needed to produce vehicles locally to avoid punishing import duties, but the smaller Canadian market couldn't support the same model diversity as the American lineup. The solution? Build cars that looked like premium American Pontiacs but used the mechanicals from more affordable, high-volume Chevrolets. This wasn't badge engineering in the modern sense. This was practical economics meeting clever manufacturing. Canadian full-size Pontiacs made use of the economical Chevrolet chassis and drivetrain, with American Pontiac-styled exterior body panels and Pontiac instrument panels. But here's the crucial detail that many people miss. The body panels weren't the same as US Pontiac panels, since they had to fit the shorter wheelbase 119-inch Chevrolet X-frame, while US Pontiacs used a full perimeter frame. Think about what this meant. Canadian engineers and designers had to create unique body panels that captured Pontiac's styling DNA while fitting onto a fundamentally different chassis. It was like tailoring a custom suit. It had to look right while accommodating completely different proportions underneath. The name Parisienne itself deserves a moment of appreciation. It arrived for 1958 as the Halo sub-series atop Laurentian in Canada, mirroring how Bonneville crowned Pontiac in the States. GM understood the power of aspirational naming. If Bonneville evoked the salt flats and speed records, then Parisienne conjured elegance, sophistication, and continental class. For Canadian buyers, this was their ticket to Pontiac prestige at a more reasonable price point. Technical specifications, the Chevrolet connection. Now let's talk about what actually made this car tick. And here's where it gets fascinating for those of us who appreciate mechanical honesty. The 1958 Parisienne rode on Chevrolet's X-frame chassis with a 119-inch wheelbase, 3 inches shorter than the American Bonneville's 122-inch span. This low-slung X-member chassis featured all-coil suspension, which was advanced for the time, but also had its quirks. The X-frame placed the main structural members in a cross pattern under the center of the car, allowing for lower floor pans but generating some criticism over side impact protection. Still, it delivered the low-slung profile that defined late 50s styling. Under the hood, the Parisienne departed dramatically from American Pontiac practice. While US Bonnevilles received the 370 cubic inch Pontiac V8, the Parisienne used Chevrolet's 348 cubic inch Astroflame V8 engine. This was Chevrolet's first big block, the pioneering member of what collectors now call the W Series engines. Let me tell you about this 348. It had a bore of 4.125 inches and a stroke of 3.25 inches. The base turbo thrust version with a 4-barrel carburetor produced 250 horsepower. But if you wanted more, and in 1958, who didn't? The super turbo thrust with triple 2-barrel carburetors produced 280 horsepower. The most potent version available late in the model year, the special turbo thrust, pushed out 315 horsepower with mechanical lifters. One documented example was completed on June 12, 1958, equipped with a 250 horsepower 348 cubic inch V8 and 2-speed Powerglide automatic transmission. Most Parisiennes came with either the Powerglide 2-speed automatic or the Turbo Glide, though a 3-speed manual was standard. The 4-speed manual would wait until the 1959 model year. Here's what made the 348 interesting from an engineering standpoint. Unlike the small block Chevrolet, the W motor designation stemmed from an SAE paper written by Chevrolet engineers John T. Roush, Howard H. Curl, and Donald H. McPherson. They were developing several new engines coded W, X, and Y, and the W design 1. The engine featured unusual wedge-shaped combustion chambers in the block rather than in the heads, allowing easier compression ratio changes without extensive retooling. Performance? With the 280 horsepower tri-power setup, a Parisienne could hold its own at the stoplight Grand Prix. The torque curve was broad and muscular, perfect for boulevard cruising or surprising the occasional Oldsmobile. And because it shared components with Chevrolet, parts availability and service were straightforward across Canada. Fact number 1. 1 year only body design. The 1958 Parisienne debuted with styling that would never be repeated. GM's 1958 models featured a 1 year only body across all divisions, making every 58 a transitional design between the restrained chrome of the mid-50s and the exuberant fins of 59. The redesigned 1958 Pontiacs were lower and larger than their predecessors, with changes including quad headlamps, broadside coves with rocket-shaped trim, conservative fins, and hooded quad tail lamps. The Parisienne captured all these elements while adapting them to the Chevrolet proportions beneath. This was pre-wide-track Pontiac. The stance hadn't yet been widened to the dramatic 63.7-inch front and 64-inch rear track that would debut in 59. Instead, the 1958 models carried a more conventional track width, which meant the wheels sat farther inboard from the fenders. To modern eyes, it creates an elegant, almost streamlined appearance, less aggressive than the wide-track cars that followed. Fact number 2. Extremely limited production. Rarity matters in the collector car world, and the 1958 Parisienne qualifies as genuinely rare. Only 759 Parisienne convertibles were built for 1958. For the Sport Coupe two-door hardtop with V8 power, just 1,026 examples were produced. Put those numbers in perspective. The American Bonneville built 12,240 units in its first year as a separate model. The Parisienne represented a fraction of that volume, built for a market roughly 1/10 the size of the US. These weren't common cars when new, and time hasn't been kind to survival rates. One sport coupe was originally sold at the 1958 London, Ontario Motor Products Show, giving us a glimpse into how these cars were marketed. They were aspirational vehicles displayed at auto shows, positioned as the premium offering in Canadian Pontiac showrooms. Laurentian held the middle ground, Strato Chief served as the entry point, and Parisienne crowned the lineup. Fact number 3, complete GM documentation. Here's something that separates the Parisienne from many period cars: comprehensive factory documentation. Unlike American GM, products of this era, Canadian cars are thoroughly documented by Vintage Vehicle Services of Oshawa. What does this mean for enthusiasts? It means you can verify original specifications, build dates, shipping information, and equipment for surviving examples. Records show exactly 759 Parisienne convertibles were made in 1958, with specific cars tracked from production through dealership delivery. For example, one documented convertible was built on February 20th, 1958, and shipped 4 days later to its original selling dealer, Dixon Motors of Winnipeg, Manitoba. This level of documentation is invaluable for restoration and authentication. Fact number 4, the Chevrolet engine. Reality. Let's address the elephant in the engine bay. For Pontiac purists, particularly those familiar with the storied Pontiac V8 engines that would dominate the 60s, the Chevrolet power plant might seem like a compromise. But context matters. Canadian Pontiacs, including the Parisienne, used the same engines and transmissions as full-size Chevrolets. This meant access to the entire Chevrolet V8 range, including eventually the 283, 327, 350, 396, 409, 427, and 454 cubic inch engines as the years progressed. In 1958, that meant the new 348. This was Chevrolet's first big block engine, originally intended for trucks but introduced in the larger, heavier 1958 passenger car line. With 4-barrel carburation producing 250 horsepower and the tri-power setup making 280, it provided legitimate performance. And here's the practical advantage. With more economical Chevrolet components under the skin, Parisienne pricing was marginally higher than US market Chevrolets, even when fitted with high-performance engines. Canadian buyers got Pontiac prestige and styling with Chevrolet-level running costs. That was compelling economics in a market where every dollar counted. Fact number 5, a unique market position. The Parisienne occupied a sweet spot in the Canadian market that had no direct American equivalent. In Canada, Pontiac was marketed as a medium-priced make with a lower price spread than in the US, closely paralleling Chevrolet's Biscayne, Bel Air, and Impala series. Think about the strategy here. GM of Canada created a Pontiac lineup that mirrored Chevrolet's hierarchy, but with different styling and aspirational branding. A Canadian buyer choosing between a Chevrolet Impala and a Pontiac Parisienne faced similar pricing but dramatically different image. The Parisienne said, "I chose Pontiac," without the price premium that separated Chevrolet and Pontiac in American showrooms. These low-price Pontiacs had styling very similar to their US cousins, but were priced very close to Chevrolet, a Pontiac for the price of a Chevrolet. For value-conscious Canadian buyers, this was irresistible. You got the Pontiac prestige, the distinctive styling, the premium dealer experience, all while keeping your budget largely intact. Market reception and cultural significance. So how did Canadians respond to the Parisienne? The answer tells us a lot about national identity and automotive preference. Canadian Pontiacs were highly successful, with Pontiac gaining market share through the 1950s until by 1960, it was Canada's number 2 selling brand after Chevrolet, with production levels 94% of Chevrolets. That's extraordinary penetration in a smaller market. Even more impressive, by 1962, Pontiac became the #1 selling brand in Canada, a title it held until the 1965 model year. Think about that. Pontiac outsold Chevrolet in Canada for 3 consecutive years. This wasn't luck. This was a carefully engineered product hitting exactly the right notes with Canadian buyers. The success created a distinctly Canadian automotive culture. Pontiac wasn't the excitement division pursuing performance-minded Americans. In Canada, it was the sensible aspiration, practical transportation with premium styling. The Parisienne represented arriving without arriving too conspicuously. The car also had export significance. The Oshawa plant supplied right-hand drive vehicles to international markets in kit form for local assembly or as completed vehicles until the late 1960s. Right-hand drive assembly continued through 1968 in markets like Australia and New Zealand. The Parisienne reached corners of the British Commonwealth where American Pontiacs never ventured. Why Americans were excluded? Here's the fundamental question: why couldn't Americans buy a Parisienne? The answer is both simple and complex. Simply put, tariffs made Canadian cars expensive in the US market, while regulatory and distribution challenges created additional barriers. But more fundamentally, the Parisienne solved a Canadian problem that didn't exist in America. US buyers who wanted a Pontiac could buy a Pontiac, with genuine Pontiac engines, Pontiac engineering, and full model lineup diversity. The market was large enough to support dedicated development and production. The Parisienne's compromise, Pontiac styling on Chevrolet mechanics, made perfect sense in Canada but offered no advantage to American buyers. Would Americans have embraced it? Probably not. The Parisienne's appeal rested on delivering Pontiac status at near Chevrolet prices. American buyers comparing a Parisienne to a genuine Bonneville would have seen the shorter wheelbase, different mechanicals, and questioned why they'd accept less when the real thing was available. The market dynamics simply didn't align. Canada needed the Parisienne, America didn't. This reality would eventually change. The Parisienne finally reached US showrooms in 1983, 3 years before it was discontinued, but by then it was a different car, essentially a rebadged Chevrolet Caprice imported when Pontiac needed a full-size rear-wheel drive model. That later, Parisienne had little in common with the distinctive 1958 original. Original values and current market. What did a Parisienne cost when new? Precise Canadian MSRP documentation from 1958 is scarce, but we can reconstruct approximate figures. The American Bonneville cost approximately $3,480 to $3,190 when new. The Parisienne, sharing similar trim levels but riding on less expensive Chevrolet underpinnings, likely came in slightly below those figures while remaining above comparable Chevrolet Impala pricing. For context, in 1958, the average American home cost about $12,000. A Parisienne represented roughly 30% of that. Significant money, but positioned as an achievable aspiration rather than an extravagance. Today's market, one 1958 Parisienne Sport Coupe, restored to Concours condition with GM of Canada paperwork, was valued at approximately $175,000. That's exceptional money reflecting extensive restoration, rarity, and condition. More typical examples in driver quality condition bring considerably less, but survivors of any condition are increasingly valuable as the collector market recognizes their historical significance. The scarcity drives value. With only 759 convertibles built and even fewer surviving, finding any 1958 Parisienne represents a noteworthy discovery. Finding one in excellent condition with documentation borders on miraculous. The legacy, the 1958 Parisienne established a nameplate that would endure for nearly 3 decades in Canada. The Pontiac Parisienne was produced from 1958 to 1986, making it one of Pontiac's longest-running model names. Through multiple generations, changing platforms and evolving market conditions, the Parisienne remained a Canadian fixture. More broadly, it demonstrated that regional product strategies could succeed. GM proved that intelligent platform sharing, thoughtful local adaptation, and sensitive market positioning could create vehicles that resonated with specific audiences. The lessons learned in Canada influenced GM's global operations for decades. The 1958 Parisienne also represents a moment of optimism in automotive history. Despite the recession, despite market challenges, GM invested in creating a unique product for Canadian buyers. They didn't just rebadge a Chevrolet or import American Pontiacs. They engineered something distinct, something that acknowledged Canadian market realities while delivering genuine value and appeal. For enthusiasts today, the 1958 Parisienne offers something increasingly rare, a genuinely unique variant from the classic era. It's not just a trim package or color option, it's a fundamentally different approach to the full-size luxury car. Finding one, preserving one, or simply appreciating one connects us to a fascinating chapter in North American automotive history. The 1958 Pontiac Parisienne reminds us that the golden age of American cars was more complex than gleaming chrome and powerful engines. It was also about market adaptation, engineering compromise, and regional identity. This car, with its Pontiac body, Chevrolet mechanicals, and distinctly Canadian character, represents automotive ingenuity solving real-world problems. It also stands as testament to a time when major manufacturers would engineer unique solutions for smaller markets. Today's globalized automotive industry rarely creates such distinct regional variations. The 1958 Parisienne couldn't exist in our modern world of platform sharing and global specifications. It was a product of its specific time and place, and we're richer for its existence. So here's my question for you. Did you ever encounter a Parisienne? Maybe you remember seeing one in Canada, or perhaps you've discovered one hiding in a barn or garage. Share your stories in the comments. Tell us about the Canadian Pontiacs you've experienced, the differences you noticed, the memories they evoke. And if you appreciate this deep dive into automotive history, hit that subscribe button and click the bell so you don't miss future episodes. We're exploring the cars that shaped North America, one fascinating story at a time. Thanks for watching. Until next time, keep those classics on the road and the history alive.